Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. For those who don't know me, I'm Ray Caspieff. I'm the Research Director, Systems and Services at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. I commend you in coming this distance with us and being here for this final panel, which is going to wrap our conference theme up with a very stimulating discussion with some fantastic speakers talking about putting families at the centre and what will it actually take. You might have noticed that we've been playing some conference highlights up here during the break, and they'll be available on our website for you to look at with other material as well. I'd just like to again acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nations, their elders and kin past and present, on whose land we meet today. Also deepest respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room. And I have great pleasure in introducing the facilitator in this session. Some of you will have met her in the morning session, and so I'm introducing again Karla Grant, who is an Australian presenter, producer and journalist, and proud Arenti woman with an extensive media career spanning more than 30 years, working primarily in Indigenous news and current affairs for NITV and SBS. Please join me in welcoming her back for this conference panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ray, for that lovely welcome, and I too wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we gather on for this conference and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and extend my respects to First Nations people who may be joining us today as well. As Ray said, this is the final panel for the day, putting families at the centre. What will it actually take? And we've got a wonderful panel of experts here to talk us through that this afternoon, and I'd like to introduce them now. First of all, we have Angie Tangaere, hopefully I've said that correctly, who is the Kai Tohu Director of Tangata Whenua, Auckland Co-design Lab. Please welcome Angie. And next we have Natalie Lewis, Commissioner of the Queensland Family and Child Commission. Welcome, Natalie. We also have Dr. Sharman Stone, the Director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies. Welcome, Sharman. And we have Liz Hefren-Webb, Deputy Secretary, Families and Communities Stream, Department of Social Services. Welcome, Liz. And finally, we have Professor Gerry Redmond, who's the Dean of Research at the College of Business, Government and Law at Flinders University. Please welcome Professor Gerry. So first of all, I thought we might start off with just if you could all tell us a little bit about yourselves and the area of expertise that you work in. So Angie, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people here in the Kulin Nation and elders past, present and emerging, and all traditional owners across the lands of Australia and Torres Strait Islanders as well. And I ask that they welcome Penny and I as we leave our Indigenous lands and land here on these. Nō reira he mihi mahana ki a tātou katoa. Karanga mai ki a mawako Penny I runga I tēnei kaupapa nunui ki a tātou. Kia ora everybody, I'm Angie Tangaere and I'm the Kai Tohu Tangata Whenua of the Auckland Co-design Lab, working alongside my co-director colleague Penny Hagan in a co-governance, co-leadership arrangement that reflects our Treaty Te Tiriti obligations in New Zealand. And this is what I think my role is. I think my role is to support our families, our communities, our hapu, our whānau, our iwi, our tribal components and structure to figure out what's best and what's going to work in terms of wellbeing into the future for them. Strength-based, Indigenous-led, and support them to lead out that innovation. And then the second part of my job is to figure out how we lift that into system and create the capability and the capacity for our systems to respond in the way that families say will matter to them. Kia ora.
Thanks, Angie. And Natalie?
Yes, so I'm Natalie Lewis, I'm a Gamilariyana. I want to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, and I want to particularly this afternoon acknowledge the children and the young people and families whose lived experience gives meaning to our collective work here. One of the real focuses for us at the Commission is to really progress a child rights agenda in Queensland. And one of the really critical parts of our job as an independent statutory body is to provide oversight of systems such as the child protection system in Queensland. But one of the things that we know, over many years, and it is not news to probably anyone here in this room, is that a lot of the problems in that system aren't going to be found in that system. So we really have been focused on extending or creating a mandate for ourselves that is rights-based, that gives us visibility and relevance in interacting and advocating in the systems like health, like early childhood, education, but also in the provision of broader services that support families to raise strong, connected children. Yep.
Thank you. Sharman. Thanks, Natalie. And Sharman?
Thank you. And I begin by acknowledging our local Kulin Nation and our Wurundjeri and their colleagues. And I have to say that it is such a joy to see us paying that respect and making that acknowledgement as we do, which wasn't, it was a fairly recent phenomenon. I think that's a fantastic thing as we sit on the stage with the Indigenous, the Torres Strait and Aboriginal flag flanking our great Australian flag. So I was born in northern Victoria, town of 400 people, Pyramid Hill, still a town of 400 people. Went to school there for my first 8 years in that little tiny town, and then onto Kerrang High School, and finally 2 years in boarding school, but it was too late because I'd already not learned any maths or languages, which in those olden days you had to have if you went to university to do an arts degree in anthropology, which is what I aspired to. So I learned about inequality and the problems of postcodes from a very early age, the accident of birth. If I'd been born in Melbourne in Kew or even Sunshine Meadows, I would have had a different early educational outcome. I was also one of 3 daughters, but my mother had to have a son because I was born on a family farm, and boys only inherit family farms in Australia in those days and still pretty much today. So I also learned early about gender inequality. And my mother was an extraordinary woman whose brothers in her family were all sent to boarding school from the family farm, her twin brother included, but she finished school after 6 years because she was a daughter and she would be going home, wouldn't she, to look after her mum until she married. So I grew up very much influenced by gender issues and by the business of distance. So no surprise, I studied anthropology at uni, because I grew up surrounded by the remnants, the physical remnants of the traditional owners who'd long gone in northern Victoria, and I was curious about who were they. Led me to a lifetime of advocacy for Indigenous rights in Australia, including working in Pentridge Prison with Aboriginal prisoners, working with the Aboriginal Education Service in Melbourne, developing curriculum on Australian race relations because we have been ignorant of our colonial past and why it is we have the trauma still of Indigenous communities as they continue to work through the impacts of that invasion in 1788. But I've also been very much engaged in environmental advocacy because of the environmental degradation in northern Victoria and what it did to communities. So I did research into that in the 80s. I was an academic for many years at the Institute of Early Childhood Development, talking about Australian society and the impacts on childhood and family. Then I got a bug and I kept thinking, I've got to be engaged in policy making. This is ridiculous. I'm working in the Victorian public sector by that stage, and I was working to ministers who were hopeless and useless. And I said, well, I can keep complaining or I can try and join them and be better. So I became After I was the Manager for International Development at Melbourne University, I was elected to Parliament in 1996, representing my home country in Northern Victoria. For 20 years I was a Member of Parliament until 2016, when I said to myself, if I want to continue to do good, to try and do the best I can to change Australia for what I think is a better place, I better leave Parliament now and continue to pursue my career in different ways. So I became the diplomat for 3 years in the Indo-Asia Pacific with women and girls, empowering women economically, politically, trying to eradicate violence. Then after that, I went back to Monash as an academic, as Professor of Practice in Gender, Peace and Security, and now I have the glorious role of being the new Director at AIFS. It is for me just a dream come true to continue to be able to work in this space, and what a joy to be at this conference with all of you like-minded people.
Thank you, Sharman. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's an amazing story. Liz.
I don't have quite as amazing a story, I don't think. So I want to join the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the beautiful country we're meeting on today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues here in the room. I'm Liz Hefren-Webb, Deputy Secretary Families and Communities at Department of Social Services. I have responsibility in that role for Commonwealth policy on child protection, family violence, community development, family support programs, a range of other matters. I'm responsible for the redress scheme for people affected by child sex abuse in institutions. So I guess I come at this one of those kind of annoying public servants who people wonder, why can't we get more done and why can't we get things changed? And so I'm bringing that experience to this stage, and so I'll try and be as honest as I can be without kind of sabotaging my career.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks for being here with us today. And Gerry.
Hi, my name is Gerry Redmond. I work at Flinders University in Adelaide. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And it's an honour to be here. It's an honour to be on their land. I feel kind of humble in the presence of all these people here who are advocates and who do things to better the lives of children and young people. And I'm kind of a bit of an egghead academic who doesn't really get to grips with things in the same way. We do research. I hope some of it's useful in some way to inform what policy does. But I'm really admirable of people who are there at the coalface, actually talking with young people, actually building relationships and trying to make their communities and the nation better. And I'm only hoping that the research I do, which is mainly around poverty and inequalities among children, can help inform that in some way.
Thank you, Gerry. Well, first of all, I'd like to ask, what is the status quo? Where do families currently fit in government and service system decision making? So I might start with you, Liz, since you're working in the government.
I sent an email to my fellow panel members last night at about 11 o'clock saying I was going to attempt a little bit of a metaphor, and they've all been saying to me they can't wait to hear this metaphor. So I'm a bit nervous about it now, but I'm gonna have a crack. So I guess I grew up in Sydney, and I was the youngest of 5 children in a very traditional, intact nuclear family. And there's a lot about family dynamics that you see play out in government. Sometimes I think it's helpful to think about kind of the Department of Social Services as what I was in that family, which was the really annoying little sister who's always asking for, more money for something and always raising an issue and always causing a complication because you're saying this actually isn't going to work for people, or, this we need to think about this differently. And then you've got kind of treasury, which is like your annoying older brother who kind of, when you come home from school, tells you everything you learnt was wrong because he's 6 years ahead of you or something. And you've got Department of Finance as your mother who's trying to kind of cut the cake and give every kid a fair share and, you know, can't listen to special pleading because, you know, you've got to be fair. And you've got Attorney General's Department, she's sort of like your grandma. No offence to the Attorney General's Department, but they're like, you know, well, you've got to go back to the Bible or you've got to go back to, you know, the Constitution or whatever it is. And so I think that's my kind of very clumsy metaphor for trying to explain how hard it can be and how you know, often the kind of needs of families are just not considered in that kind of policy making cycle, and Sharman will have experienced this as well. And so, you know, often key big decisions about resourcing and government are made by cabinets in a 5-minute burst based on 3 paragraphs of text, you know, and there's a lot of work that goes into that, and trying to get kind of a family-centred approach into that ultimate decision place is not easy, and you know, we need you guys, a lot of people, to be doing the advocacy, so the voice has to be listened to. Because if it's just us saying we really need to consider the impact of this on families, that won't necessarily, you know, we are the annoying little sister down in Tuggeranong. So I think, you know, from my perspective, having been in the public service now 26 years, you know, I've dedicated myself to kind of refining this art and trying to be the voice of people who haven't got a voice where I can be, noting I don't speak for them. I can only reflect that they might have something to say about it. But there are systems and processes that do really mitigate against having families at the centre. And I've seen different attempts to try and overcome this, and at one stage we had this thing called family impact statements that you had to attach to every cabinet submission, and they were the worst thing ever. We should never do that again, because they just kind of, this attachment, no one read them, no one looked at them, tick. So, you know, there's been solutions tried, but we have to keep thinking about what's the way to I guess, crack this nut.
And we will talk about that during this 1 hour. But Sharman, from your point of view, where do you feel families currently fit in government and service system decision making?
Well, I think it's very difficult because we only have a 3-year federal electoral cycle, and that we only have a very short period for forward estimates, 3 or so years in terms of funding cycles. It's rare to get beyond a 3-year funding go. We have a federation, so the states are all lined up with a lot of the responsibilities for a whole range of things, but including family matters, policing and so on. So we have inconsistencies of regulation, and you just look at the gambling regulation across Australia at the moment and what the impacts of that on how advertising is running, amok and doing all sorts of harm to our young kids. So we're in a complicated system in order to have a consistent long-term view. Funding is short-term. We have, in Australia though, compulsory voting, so everybody counts in the sense of politically making a new government possible. But I think there's enormous goodwill, and I'm not sort of terribly pessimistic. When we've got someone like Liz sitting beside us, saying what she just said, she is a big banana in this business of being the DepSec of DSS, and in a driver's seat to be looking at what sort of programs are coming forward and how they're funding. And she has this attitude about families must be centre. So when we've got people like Liz in the chair, and Ray Griggs, I don't think is here any longer, the secretary who's been of DSS, who's been with us for much of the time, who has the same sorts of beliefs and sentiments, well, we're in a good place comparatively. The trouble is it's hard to do. What we're talking about is really hard to do because, and I won't go on now because I want you want others to respond to this question, but for example, we can have the best of intentions, but within our families themselves, there are power dynamics, which means they're often patriarchal, misogynist. The family unit itself or non-English speaking background, or not sure of the Australian cultural traditions about how they should break through and get their thoughts heard. And we're talking, let's make, listen to youth and families. How do you, say you're talking about coercive reproduction, and the woman is from a cultural background, fairly newly arrived, where she's seen and not heard, and she cannot attend the doctor, certainly a gynaecologist, obstetrician or midwife, without her husband present. And she's experiencing, she doesn't know that rape in marriage is even illegal. So these sorts of issues we're talking about too, and trying to tap into family needs and values, hear the voice, but when some of those voices have to be liberated, empowered in order to be able to be sitting beside us talking even. So lots of challenges.
Gerry, just from your research, where do families currently fit into the scheme of things?
Yeah, I thought Liz's point is really interesting, that Cabinet looks at 3 lines and makes their decisions to spend billions on the basis of that. And I know at the state level, I've had PhD students that look at this, the amounts are smaller, but the process is pretty similar. So my concern has been in terms of producing the evidence that policymakers might want to engage with. And part of that is the voices of children and young people, getting their voices right into the policy agenda. But often accompanying that, they have demanded, for example, the statistics as well. Okay, we've heard these voices, but we want to know how many are there, how many in this position and that position. And getting these statistics is really important, and that's one thing. But then actually putting it into a form, translating it into a form that policymakers want to act on at that particular point in time is extremely difficult, because the policy agenda, to my mind, often moves very quickly. And so what fits this week may be out the window next week. So there's an element of, which I find very unfortunate, there's an element of chance in all this. And probably when you have a new government is when the doors are more open than they ever would be otherwise, because all these other things haven't come and to bombard all the ministers yet. So maybe if you've got ideas, these are the times to be putting your hand up and pushing them.
Mm-hmm. Natalie, I might go to you next. What are the issues from your perspective and in what you do? Why aren't families at the centre?
Well, I absolutely believe that they can be. I totally understand, like, the processes of government decision making, and that can be slow, and believe me, I'm not a patient person, and I struggle daily to work in this space. But look, I think that there's an opportunity to disrupt that when we've got decades of looking at that not delivering outcomes in the interests of children and families. I think we've all got an obligation. I don't care what your position description is. I would love for people to walk out of here and think of themselves as advocates. Children are rights holders. We're all duty bearers. So I feel like there's opportunities, I think, in each of our roles to advocate, for children and young people, to create space for children and young people to have a say. And if I can give an example, in Queensland, of some of our youth advocates that work with us with lived experience with the Commission. I guess I have lived experience with the Commission, but relevant lived experience in a number of different areas. So, rather than the Commission feeling that we own this space and we need to involve ourselves in the parliamentary committee process, what we felt was our obligation was actually to create space for young people to sit directly in front of the parliamentary committee and tell them exactly what needed to happen in the space of mental health. And they were phenomenal. The clarity with which they explained their experience, the insights in terms of the solutions that were required, and they kind of left us thinking we've got no excuse not to do those things. And when we see the parliamentary committee report come out last week or whatever, no surprises, the best parts of that, the most compelling parts of that came directly from our young people. So I think that we've got obligations to disrupt. I think we've got obligations to children and young people, and flawed government processes aren't a good enough excuse not to act.
Angie.
I'm probably going to echo what Natalie's just said. Penny and I are really fortunate to be in a position where we're working alongside families in place and in the system with leaders across agencies. So we've got this really incredible opportunity to be bringing those worlds together. And our work really is about thinking about how young people and families, we're not just hearing their voices, they're advocating for themselves in these forums of power, and they're leading out what they need to be doing or what needs to be designed or what the alternative is. So we're focused on really thinking about how are we creating the spaces, the platforms and the processes where young people, children and families are at the table. They're not just advocating for themselves though, they're applying their lived experience to what the new thing is that we need to be doing, and they're in the process end to end. So it's much less about hearing a voice and much more about creating the spaces of sharing power and control, so those families and young people and children are part of developing the solutions rather than just telling the story. And I don't just say just telling the story because it's important, but what I'll say for what I've observed in my experience of central government in New Zealand is that it's just too easy to get someone to tell a sad story, and then that sad story is one impact statement that people go, oh, that's terrible, but the 3 lines tell us we've got to put the funding here. So we're really passionate about how you build the capacity with senior leadership and with system to start to think about what those platforms of co-creation are, where young people, children and families are seen as equal partners with the same power and influence as those in the system. We're working with communities that you would argue, I'm sure you all are too, are the furthest removed from the central power that makes this policy decision, that make these budget. They're the furthest from anyone in the community. So our job is to collapse the distance between those people that are marginalised and all of where all this power. We don't know the answer. We're just working it out as we go, and we're just giving things a try. But I'll just end by saying that just as you were saying, Natalie, for most of our senior leaders, it's more transformational to be in a room with communities that they've thought one thing about them and discovered they are incredibly talented, resilient, they've got answers. So there's a thing happening which shifts when you have our communities and our senior leaders come together. So that's what we've been focused on trying to figure out.
And Sharman, what do you feel are the issues? Why aren't families at the centre? You talked about inequality and issues of education.
That's right. I think what you're just describing in New Zealand, there's elements of that in Australia too, and you've just described that too, Nat, in terms of some community groups being given the chance, being facilitated, being visited. I remember when we did a lot of inquiries looking at Indigenous issues like retention of language. We didn't sit in Canberra and wait for plane loads of people to arrive and give evidence. We actually flew out to Back and Beyond and had interpreters, translators, and we sat down on the ground with the people and listened. Very important. Listening's easy though. What comes after listening? I mean, we often think, oh, we've got to listen. Sure, we've got to listen, but my dog listens, you know, but nothing much comes back, really. So listening is the first point. One of my real concerns is the growing inequalities in Australia. I mentioned them, I observed them in my early life, but I think it's growing where people are further and further from decision making, from perhaps meeting even their own member of parliament or local government representative. A lot of our single parents or unemployed families or those who can't find affordable accommodation. All of those extra COVID-related pressures that have occurred make it harder and harder for people to lift their head above the daily survival efforts to then tune into, oh, there's a community consultation taking place at the school that's going to ask us what we feel about work experience for our oldest child or whatever. It's very difficult for some families, some individuals to be able to participate in that effort. And I think as government representatives or NGOs or commissions with the human rights or whatever, commissioners, we've got to have time. People who can relate to those communities, look like those communities. We've heard a lot about this in this conference, making sure you employ the right sort of people, like Berry Street this morning, where we're talking about employing our latest new arriving refugees to work with fellow humanitarian settlers and so on. But in the past, I think we've tended to parachute in experts who've got a short-term contract to find out what that community thinks. They might meet with the faith leaders and perhaps an organisation that says it represents that group, but you don't work out if they really do. And so we've got to spend more time, be more expert, listen and act, and this time element, build relationships with those that we want to communicate with, whether you're an NGO, a government agency, local, state or federal. And we often don't do that. We're on about a consultancy. You've got a 6-month consultancy, get in there, find out what's happening, write a report, send it off, tick, and it's a different way of working. It's a community development approach that we need more than just tick and flick. So it's a whole new set of skills. And I think the beautiful thing in this 3 days of conference, we've heard literally, I think, hundreds of speakers, include the Q&A sessions. Everyone's in furious agreement. Now, this is where we need to go. So as long as we've got all these individuals championing this new approach, there is hope. There's absolute hope that we'll achieve this new way of doing things. But let me sort of end on this point. The thing that really worries me, and we've talked about this, Karla, I am desperately worried about the quality of our access to education, the educational experience of families who can't afford to pay for a private schooling or a slightly better schooling in their local communities. So you've got these residual populations of most needy families in the local state school, or they call it public school in New South Wales, where the teachers are exhausted or disinterested or both. The school infrastructure itself is ordinary and awful. The kids may have no role models amongst the parents who are in work, no mums who've got a reasonable education themselves, and we know one of the number one issues of child well-being and aspirations in their own lives is their mother's education, right? So the mums themselves aren't literate numerate. Imagine the homeschooling over COVID, where your mum's never used a computer and she's not literate numerate, and suddenly she's meant to be looking after a year 8 son or daughter's schooling. I mean, horrific stuff. So I'm also a huge advocate for going back and looking at what's happening to our government-funded education systems. They're no longer places of upward mobility for our kids, or places of compensation, or places of engaging families. They're often reinforcing and creating greater inequality. That's disastrous for our country.
So what are the opportunities for change? How can the needs and perspectives of families be centralised in policy and research development from the outset? Gerry?
Yeah, I think Sharman hit on some really important points there. And it does come back to education to a very large extent. I've been doing some work recently in some schools where we've been talking with parents, and we've been talking with the students, and we've been talking with the teachers. And it's like the students and the teachers are going to totally different schools. You know, the students are saying, well, there's all these issues that the school isn't dealing with, and the teachers are going about the wonderful facilities we have and how the students all love it, and it's and the parents there are saying, for students who have particular health issues or whatever, they're saying, Yeah, well, there's no coordination between what the school does and then what the local psychologist or the health service does, and it seems like it's a bit of a mess. And part of the problem is that the teachers don't speak the language of the parents. This is my interpretation of it. That the teachers are they're kind of like brought up in with a particular cultural capital that speaks to let's say middle class parents. But if you're dealing with working class or poorer parents who have a different set of cultural capital, you don't get this communication. So I think somewhere at the start of all this, we need to find better ways of helping education systems communicate better with all people from lots of different cultural backgrounds, not just the ones that are similar to where the bulk of the teachers come from. That seems to be one place where we can start. Like, there are lots of fantastic teachers out there, and there's lots of really good work that goes on. But still, I think there needs to be more work done in terms of linking student needs and teachers' responses from the little bit of work I see.
Liz, did you want to add anything there?
I mean, I suppose I'm going to get myself in trouble, but you know, there are systems of power that flow from private education. I mean, you see it all the time, right? So, you know, kids who go through that system, the networks that they come out with are, you know, a natural kind of networks of power, and the opportunities they have to do leadership programs and all that sort of stuff. So I guess when part of my kind of what I try and do is think, well, who's not getting access to those networks of power or those opportunities, and, you know, how can I kind of sneakily divert some resources sometimes? If I, you know, occasionally I can hide it from the system, but to amplify the voices of people who haven't got those networks, and so advocacy groups and you know, people who are citizen kind of advocates, or you know, who can provide another platform for the development of alternate sources of power. Because, I mean, essentially that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about kind of some parts of our community having a stepping stone into the pathway to power that others don't have. And so I think, you know, talking about how do you put family voices or voices of children at the centre, they need an opportunity, they need a platform, and they need to be resourced and given time to develop the skills as well, because getting up and speaking in front of a Senate committee or something, that's a really hard thing to do. And you know, if you've been doing debating for 5 years at your private school, you're probably not going to struggle that much to kind of give some evidence or give some testimony, but you need the support to do it. So
I think it's worth saying, yeah, the children's commissioners are playing a really important role in this. In that, I know, like in South Australia, they're out meeting people, young people all the time, and bringing their voices to policymakers, because they do have access to the ministers and the policymakers. And similarly, I can see that Natalie is doing similar work in Queensland.
Natalie, what do you feel are the opportunities for change, and what can policy and research professionals do in their roles to put families at the centre?
I think, you know, to harp on rights, I'm going to just keep going back to that, and whether we're talking about education or whether we're talking about quality access to health. These are rights of children. These are things that as a nation we signed up to over 30 years ago, but that yet we routinely fail to deliver to parts of our community. And I think that we focus on equitable access, you know, to education. We've got to look at some of the way the systems are structured, where they start to look at education or access to a quality education as being a courtesy or an act of benevolence. It is a right, it is an obligation of ours to deliver that for children and young people. And I think that, you know, when we look at things like educational attendance and that access to education. We look at Queensland, and in the last 12 months, there were over 1,000 children that were suspended or expelled from prep through the use of student disciplinary absences. Now, those children have a right to an education, and if they're unable, if the school is unable to meet those needs, there is still remaining a duty, an obligation to be able to provide an educational experience so that we don't have 1,000 kids now disrupted in their education and sent off on a pathway where they will never enjoy equity, like across a range of domains in their lives. So I think that there are things that might seem like an oversimplification, but reminding ourselves of the promise we made to kids 30 years ago about what we would deliver to them as signatories to the UNCRC, I think that'd be a really good starting point.
Angie, I'll just go to you. What do you feel are the opportunities for change?
I think I'll just build on the conversation about school, because we're having a similar challenge in Aotearoa and in New Zealand about the growing gap between those that can afford to have the sort of social capital that kids do when they come out of a private school versus kids that are coming through, and if they're lucky, having a couple of years in a senior school in the public system or not. We have a very unfortunate trend of, I think you're talking about it too, Natalie, is that if we're thinking about what the gap between private and public school is, and where when I say where Indigenous and marginalised people are getting excluded from the public school, then you've got double the problem, because we're not even making it through the public sector, the public system, which is so far away from the private one. But I just think it's a matter of us, number one, thinking how are we showing up in the system. It's kind of what you're throwing the provocation out, what am I doing in the system that's, am I actually perpetuating something that isn't working in the system? What am I doing about it? How am I sharing power? What am I challenging in here? As a starting point for practitioners, right? But there's something really, I think there's something really powerful in what Liz is saying about the social capital. Because another thing we need to be thinking about is what are we valuing and what are we resourcing as a system? Because it doesn't seem like it's stacking up what we've got as indicators and targets for our most marginalised populations, those experiencing the most inequity. Social capital and pro-social relationships, the ability to have people around you that support you unconditionally and then give you opportunities to progress yourself, might not even be about money. It might be about you want to do that with your life, you want to connect to your culture, you want to learn your language, you want to do better. These are things that families and young people are telling us are things that if we could invest in them and enable them in where they are, in their place, that's going to make a difference. So one of the things I think we need to think about is like, what's the power and privilege that we have ourselves as practitioners in the system? What are we doing to share that? And then also, what are we valuing and how are we advocating for change about the things that we're counting, measuring, tracking, whatever, and reorientating to the things that families and children and young people are telling us matter in place. And our experience in the work that we're doing, Penny and I, is that they're so far away from what we're procuring as government. So it's really about how we're trying to shift towards what does matter for families.
And
I'll just get around, that it's not necessarily about like pinning all our hopes on some big new policy announcement. I think that those small, intentional shifts by adults make a massive difference in the lives of children. So around that issue of equity, you are all absolutely as well positioned as any decision maker sitting around a table to make a positive difference in the lives of children. So, but when it comes to that national policy stuff, and I've got to say, I've worked with Liz for a long time, and we might sit on opposite sides of the table, but 99% of the time we're on the same side of the issue. And I think that it's really important for us to actually think about those relationships in terms of decision making, but more importantly, where we can really make a difference is in those relationships with the children and families that we work with. So, yeah.
So, Gerry, I wanted to ask you, what does it take to think of families as contributors to the community and the economy rather than a collection of problems or challenges?
I think it requires a different kind of way of thinking about how people contribute to society. I mean, the one that was brought up in a presentation I saw earlier was the if you try to value the amount of caring work that people do, it's massive, right? And the only bit of caring work that's actually measured is the bit where it's paid for. But there's all this free caring work that's done by family members, by people in the community that's just totally ignored. And so I think what we need is a different set of metrics about how we measure contributions. So it's not, I don't think dollars is really where it should be at. It's about building a better society. It's about how we all work together. And I think we've got quite a long way to go to actually get there. But particularly where it comes to people who are marginalised and disadvantaged, they're seen as very often as at risk, as vulnerable, as dependent, whereas in fact they're very often actively contributing to their community, to their society, to their own families, and I think this needs to be taken into account much more. So I'd like to see a shift away from, if you like, the dollar measurement, and more towards like what Penny Hagen and Angie were talking about, more about well-being in terms of how we see our society.
Angie, would you like to add something there?
Yeah, just building on what Gerry's saying, some of the work, the most exciting innovation work I've seen has come out of young people and families. And it's because, and it's already been said, the solutions for the compounded complex problems we've got don't sit in the systems we've got, those of what have created them. So the thinking and the processes and the training and all of that stuff that sit in the system now, it's never going to solve these complex challenges. You almost have to be out of it and have this as well. We talk about Indigenous-led thinking as being, we think, one of the most powerful ways for us to grapple with the complex challenges we've got. But I don't just see them as a voice or even contributors to this. I see them as the leading innovators in what's going to be different, to think beyond service, to think beyond system intervention, deficit approaches, because they just don't think like that, right? So the most exciting stuff that I've seen, there's other exciting stuff too, guys, in Aotearoa, don't worry. But the most exciting things that we're working on at the moment is usually led by young people, children and families, leading our innovations, and that's because the insight and the values that sit at the heart of what they're trying to do are absolutely opposite to what the ideologies and the values are that are sitting in the heart of our most powerful. So I'll come back to that as closing comments, if that's all right, about what the big deal is. But yeah, I just feel so inspired by what we see our communities can build based on what the values are, the principles, the well-being models. So that's why we think this work, our work is so important, is to lift that up and say there are compelling alternatives to what we're doing right now. And I'm sure it's true for you guys too in your communities. There are compelling alternatives, but the big work is about how we reconfigure and reorientate what we're doing at the moment towards what the future can be.
So, Sharman, what enablers are needed to include families in decision making and co-design of policies, programs and services?
Certainly, we need to begin with the recognition that without the families, the young people, the elderly, whomever, without them participating in the policy development at those early stages, those policies are not going to be as good as they should be. In fact, they might fail. So we need to have that recognition that this is an important element of any research activity, leading to policy development, that the stakeholders, the actual people who are dealing with, they're part of that co-planning, co-design, or even doing the research, going out and getting the data, the information themselves. That's a mindset. It takes a different set of skills to implement, but it's not rocket science. And our governments, local, state and federal, are littered with policies that didn't work simply because we didn't really mine the information that the consumers can give us. One small example, the basic card or the cashless, credit card, it had one of its first expressions or implementations was in Shepparton, the main population of my old electorate, and it wasn't Indigenous focused, it was anyone who was on Centrelink payments. It was across the community. And we formed a committee, as you do, to help inform this policy's development. And it consisted of some local community leadership and local government reps and Primary Care Connect people and so on. And the first thing we said was, look, now make sure that if you're going to be giving up this card, which translates people's cash payments to, if you like, credit, where they could go to certain places, couldn't buy alcohol or tobacco. You all know what I'm talking about, that card, yep. We said, look, make sure that you have financial literacy training as part of it, so that, particularly with single mums who are getting it, that they would get, some better information about how to best manage the bit of cash they will be getting. And by the way, you'll have to have childcare associated with that, so they can attend the financial literacy training, and you'll need transport because they all live in tiny towns. There's no public transport. Yeah. We also said, oh, by the way, remember, if you can't have alcohol, Aldi's, which is cheapest by 30% in our areas for basic groceries, they have alcohol also goes through the same cash register. How are you going to separate that out? So our people with this cash card can still use Aldi's and get their 30% cheaper groceries. And, yep, here, came back. They didn't do that. They banned Aldi's from the cash card. It wasn't in your era, it's okay. It wasn't part of your story, I think. So overnight, the lowest income people in our community couldn't use the two local Aldi's. Their card wouldn't work there, so they had to pay 30% more for their groceries. There was no financial literacy training. There was no support childcare, whatever. It was just that suddenly you had a lot of your cash was quarantined and said you had the card. So we became very clever in our community about how you traded that card for buying a fridge or a microwave or something for a mate who then paid you in cash for that and so on. But it was just such a simple example of the locals had it, they knew how this would work and how it could, it wasn't being opposed up front, how it could advantage people, but it wasn't followed through. And so it failed. And it's a sad thing. So to cut a long story short, you listen, you take action, you make sure, as we keep saying, you have safe places where people who perhaps have never before made a submission or talked frankly about their life experience or what they need to officials, they feel confident to do that. You have interpreters, translators. In my communities, we have huge non-English speaking background proportions of population. All those people are in play. You don't rely on their kids to translate for them. All of those things, they're not rocket science. We know what works, we know how to do it. We just have to have the will, the time, the commitment, and it can be a better place and better outcomes, I think. Yeah.
Liz, I might go to you as someone who's working in the Department of Social Services. I mean, what are you going to do to include families more?
So, I was going to make a slightly different point, which, the Australian government has an Australian Bureau of Statistics. It's a very large organisation. It's a very terrific organisation. Gathers a lot of quantitative data, which, is used to inform policy, but we have no equivalent kind of version that focuses on the qualitative experience of people and the voices of people. And so, again, when governments are making decisions, often in less than ideal circumstances, or quickly, or when they're dealing with 17 issues on a cabinet agenda, the statistics tend to override, and the statistics, often paint that kind of deficit story, because you're just looking at inequality, or you're looking at exclusions from school, or you're looking at, experiences with the justice system or experiences with the child protection system, and to get the kind of positive strengths that families offer, you have to actually go and talk, and you have to hear from them, and you have to hear what their ideas are. And we don't make a lot of space for that in our, you know, just in our architecture of our government. We don't kind of systematically fund that. We do in specific places and for specific projects and in specific ways. And different departments do quite a lot individually, but it's not a kind of it's not a collective effort.
Yeah. We're getting the wind up here. But I just wanted to go to Natalie, just to talk about, you know, are there any good examples? I think you wanted to talk about some good examples of instances where, you know, families have been placed at the centre.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are some great examples in Queensland around the family participation program. So the rollout of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander family-led decision making. Very, very different than what we've come to know as family group meetings, family group conferencing. Having families determine the guest list and having those meetings, those processes facilitated by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from their own community disrupts the power imbalance, brings the right people to the table and positions families to actually have primary input into the things that are most profoundly going to affect their lives. And I think that those models, as they're rolling out across Queensland in the context of child protection, have significant application across a range of social policy areas. So when we're talking about health equity strategies or early childhood, design of local services, I think that type of model pays attention to this sort of principle of centering the people that are most impacted. And I think that in any spaces where we can do that, that is where we will see some positive outcomes. So, and that's not beyond us, right? So there's no excuse not to do it.
Angie, just finally to you, very briefly, what are some best practices where families have been involved?
Very, very similar to what Natalie's saying, where you're creating the space and the process for families. Or we have tried to be creating those through cultural practices where they feel safe and valued and acknowledged, and they're able to dream their dreams, and they're able to think through what's going to help them to achieve their dreams in a non-deficit, strength-based way. So the things that they're doing are by nature they're system innovation, because they're so different to what we're doing now. But it's all about what Nellie's saying here about what are the conditions you're creating in the spaces, what are the relationships to support families to feel they can lead out, and then of course the real work is lifting into system. I just wanted to say this: the big deal for us is that we've got to be challenging the values, the ideologies that sit at the heart of systems that are creating this inequity. For us in Aotearoa, and I'm sure across the world, most of that is around institutional racism, and that is really, really hard to approach for some people and to build the capability. But that's what it is for us. It's creating the spaces for our families and our children to lead, and then challenging the system enough that you're digging deep enough into what the problem is, not surface stuff like it's not the right program. It's that the attitude and the mindsets and the leadership that are driving it are fundamentally, I would say, misaligned with today. That was what I wanted to raise. Thank you, Karla.
I don't think we have any time for a Q&A, which we were hoping to do, because we are getting the wind up by the boss here. So, will you please thank all our panellists, Angie Tangaere, Natalie Lewis, Sharman Stone, Liz Hefren-Webb and Gerry Redmond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karla, and thank you to the panellists. I'm actually going to ask you to play Pass the Parcel. Because I'm not going to kind of walk up the podium and navigate the legs. So thank you very much. That was a wonderful note to finish on, of possibility.
Okay.
Thank you, Karla.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much.
So before you all go running off, Sharman would just like to share a few thoughts just for a few minutes. So thank you very much. Thank you, Sharman.
Thank you. I know people have probably got planes to catch or buses to chase or something, but we couldn't end without, I don't think, congratulating ourselves, all of us, because this conference has been the culmination of about 740 people, like-minded people, from incredibly faraway places like New Zealand, but also Toowoomba, Cairns, Broome, who've come together all to work out how we can better inform policy, practice, evaluate what we do to make sure that every child has the best possible life in our countries. Every family feels safe, is respected, and can live in peace and harmony in our great country. And it's a huge challenge for us because we've just been talking about inequalities and all of the inequities, racism, misogyny, you know, we know the list. But we've all been working hard to think of a better place, how we can land. We've looked at best practice. I've heard some fantastic ideas. We've heard about what hasn't worked. People have been very honest and frank in their papers or their presentations. Thank you for that. I have to say that I think one of the hardest things is looking at each day, those 7 consecutive sessions, which one could you go to without missing out on all the others. So what we'll do at AIFS is make sure that we put up online and perhaps even a physical production of all of the papers, overheads and whatever we can get our hands on. We've got, of course, most of them right now. And we've been talking about this, how we'll do it, so that you can check in and catch up with all of those concurrent sessions that you had to miss out on. You can chase people up, you can look up all those references that were given, because it's just been too good to miss, because there's other equally excellent sessions. I need to thank Karla, of course, for this session and the other she gave, and our fabulous panellists here who've been so fantastic in giving us your expertise and your thoughts and pushing us along to do better. I have to congratulate, in particular, my own AIFS team who, you can imagine how much work has gone into all this country. Over 2 years, because we were aborted in our 2020 effort. But the actual team, I'm going to risk missing out someone, but I'm going to actually say that we've had a conference steering committee, and we have, in particular, Alistair Lamont. Alistair, you want to wave your arm about? Where are you? There he is. Done a fabulous job. I didn't recognise him when I first saw him Tuesday morning in a suit. Very, very fantastic. But Lucy Krell, Lucy, where are you? Their fantastic effort. Our wonderful Tracy Young, I know you're just here, Tracy, who's their leader. Lisa Carroll, Lisa, where are you? Perhaps she's not here. There she is, right. And Anne Kyle, who's another one of our comms people. And there's been, of course, Shaz Walsh as well, who's down the back, who's been just rushing around, joining all the dots. So on behalf of the executive at AIFS, we've just been the recipient of so much hard work and good effort from all of the AIFS team. So thank you so much, everybody. Our sponsors have been fantastic too. And let me run through our partner, of course, Department of Social Services. We still have Lynn with us representing her. Let me mention the Minister too. Wasn't she fantastic with her very long explanation yesterday of where she aims to go with her new portfolio? It was brilliant having our Minister with us yesterday. But our partner, Department of Social Services, but we also have the support of our other major sponsors, the Attorney General's Department, Department of Health, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, Victorian Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, the Centre of Social Research and Methods, and the Australian National University. I hope I haven't missed any. Lots of other sponsors who I hope you visited in all their booths out there. You can get the most fabulous handouts from them. I'm sure they don't want to take them back home. So collect those up before you go. We've had fantastic staff volunteers too. I mentioned those in passing. And let me just say that I was a bit worried with a 3-day conference. I thought at the end of Friday, you're not going to be able to still be here. To see this room full of people is fantastic. And let me say that with all of us dedicated to the cause of putting families at the centre, what possibly can go backwards? Why can't we look to a better future of greater equity, greater well-being amongst all of our families in all their shapes and forms in Australia? So my very best wishes to everybody on behalf of the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and I wish you all well in the future, and thank you so much for being an active part of this conference. Thank you. After that, I thought we should sing a song or something.